Silas Thorne was mending a fishing net in the cold, damp dark of his shack. The tiny room smelled of rain on dust and the perpetual poverty that clung to the walls like mold. He knew the rules of the scrap, the forgotten spit of land he called home. Rule 1. Mind your own business. Rule 2. Never show weakness. And especially Rule 3. Never, ever trust what comes from the Broken Fang Mountains. He knew the rules. He lived by them. They were the only reason a man as thin as a winter reed, with more books than bread, had survived this long. He knew the stories of the things that lurked in the mountain passes. Orcs, monsters with green skin and tusks, bred for war and death. The stories were a wall between his world and theirs, a wall built of fear and ancient hatred. But when a crash of splintering wood echoed from his tiny, half-rotten goat pen, he found her. An orc. Trapped, bleeding, and desperate, her massive form impossibly wedged in the collapsing structure. Beside her, a small orc child shivered, his eyes wide with terror. Silas saw the raw panic in the warrior's gaze, the protective curve of her body around the child, and the dark, glistening blood that stained her leg. He saw a monster, but he also saw a mother, or a sister. He saw family. And in that moment of shivering rain and desperate gasping breaths, Silas Thorne broke the most important rule of all. He took a step forward. And that choice, that single, foolish, compassionate choice, changed everything. The wind howled, whipping a cold spray of rain through the gaping hole in his goat pen. The wood, already soft with rot, had given way completely under the orc's weight. She lay twisted, one powerful leg caught beneath a heavy support beam, the splintered end of it buried deep in her thigh. Every ragged breath she took was a testament to agony. Her skin, the color of moss and shadow, was slick with rain and blood. Her eyes, the color of burnt gold, were locked on him. They held no malice, only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and a fierce primal warning. Don't come near the child. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. His first instinct, the instinct screamed into him by every village elder and every fireside tale, was to run. Bar the door of his shack, pile the furniture against it, and pray she bled out before she could free herself. She was an orc, a killer, a savage from the mountains who would sooner gut him and eat his meager rations than thank him. That was the law of the world. But his eyes kept flicking from her pain-contorted face to the small child huddled behind her. The boy couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 in human years. He was a miniature version of the warrior, all sharp angles and wide, terrified eyes. He clutched a fold of her leather tunic, his knuckles white. He wasn't growling or snarling like the monsters in the stories. He was just crying, silent tears tracking clean paths through the grime on his green cheeks. Poverty had been a constant companion for Silas, a dampness that seeped into his bones. He knew the ache of an empty stomach, the bite of a winter wind through a threadbare coat. He knew what desperation felt like, and looking at them, he saw his own reflection in a shattered, green-skinned mirror. They were outcasts, same as him, hunted, starving, broken. He swallowed the fear. It tasted like rust and bile. I'm not going to hurt you, he said. His voice was a thin, reedy thing, nearly lost in the wind's shriek. The orc warrior narrowed her eyes. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound like grinding stones. It vibrated through the damp air, a clear threat. She tried to shift, to pull her leg free, and a sharp cry of pain escaped her lips. Her tusks, smaller than the ones in the terrifying drawings but no less intimidating, were bared in a grimace. "Let me help," Silas said, taking another tentative step. He held his hands up, palms open, a gesture of peace, a gesture of utter foolishness. "The wood, it's driven into your leg. It needs to come out." She watched him, her gaze sharp and analytical. She was a warrior. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the calluses on her hands, the practiced way she assessed him as a threat. And she must have seen none. He was all sharp elbows and knees, his tunic patched in a dozen places, his face pale with hunger and worry. He was no danger to a healthy child, let alone a full-grown orc. Slowly, deliberately, she gave a short, sharp nod. It was a concession born of pure desperation. Silas's breath hitched. This was it. He was doing this. He scrambled back into his shack, his mind racing. He needed leverage, a pry bar. He had nothing of the sort. His gaze landed on a long, sturdy piece of driftwood he'd been saving to repair his leaking roof. It would have to do. He grabbed it, along with the tattered remnants of a blanket, and hurried back out into the storm. "This is going to hurt," he warned, his voice tight. He wedged the end of the driftwood under the heavy beam pinning her leg. He could smell the coppery tang of her blood now, mixed with wet leather and something else, something earthy and wild, like a forest after a storm. She just grunted in response, her jaw tight. She wrapped her arms more securely around the child, murmuring something to him in a language that was all harsh consonants and soft gutturals. The boy buried his face in her side. Silas took a deep, shaky breath and put all of his meager weight onto the makeshift lever. The wood groaned. The beam shifted. A fraction of an inch. A scream, raw and guttural, was torn from the orc's throat. She bit down on it, stifling it, but the sound echoed in the small, miserable yard, a pure note of agony. Silas's muscles screamed in protest. He was not a strong man. His arms trembled, sweat and rain mingling on his brow. "Again," she gasped out, the single word a command. He repositioned the lever, his heart pounding. He had to do this. He had to. He threw his entire being into the effort, a silent prayer on his lips. The beam lifted. It rose a few precious inches, just enough. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength she didn't seem to possess a moment before, the orc wrenched her leg free. She collapsed back against the broken wall of the pen, panting, her eyes squeezed shut. The shard of wood remained in her thigh, a grotesque monument to her injury. Blood, dark and thick, pulsed around it. Silas dropped the driftwood and rushed to her side, the blanket in his hands. "We have to stop the bleeding." She opened her eyes. They were glazed with pain, but the suspicion was still there, a flickering ember. He knelt, hesitated, then gently began to wrap the ragged blanket around the wound, applying pressure. Her skin was warm, surprisingly smooth beneath his trembling fingers. He worked quickly, his movements clumsy but determined. He was no healer, but he'd patched up enough cuts and scrapes on himself to know the basics. Stop the bleeding, keep it clean, pray. The child, Grok, watched him with wide, unblinking eyes. He hadn't moved from his spot. "My name is Silas," he said, needing to fill the heavy silence. What should I call you?" The warrior was quiet for a long moment, her breathing evening out into a slow, ragged rhythm. "Garza," she finally rasped. Her voice was deep, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "He is Grok, my brother." Brother, not son. The realization shifted something in Silas's perception. She was young then, maybe not much older than him. A sister, protecting her little brother, fleeing something. "You can't stay out here," Silas said, stating the obvious. The rain was turning colder, and the wind was relentless. Infection would set in quickly. "My home. It isn't much, but it's dry and warm." Gaza looked from Silas's earnest, worried face to the dilapidated shack. It was barely more than a hovel, cobbled together from driftwood and scavenged planks. A thin curl of smoke rose from a rusty pipe in the roof, promising a fire within. It was pathetic. It was a palace. She looked at Grok, who was shivering violently now, his small face pale. Her honor, her pride, every instinct screamed at her not to accept help from this fragile, soft-skinned creature. But her duty to her brother screamed louder. Survival was a weapon, and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. With another slow, painful nod, she acquiesced. The debt was being forged. A debt of life. Getting her inside was an ordeal. Silas was weak, and Gaza, despite her immense strength, could barely put weight on her injured leg. He supported her, his thin shoulder pressed against her solid, muscular side. She was heavy, all dense muscle and bone. He grunted with the effort, his own meager frame protesting. Grok trailed behind them, a small, silent shadow, his eyes darting everywhere. The inside of the shack was a single small room. A fire pit in the center, a thin straw mattress in the corner, a wobbly table with one chair, and shelves crammed with books. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and old paper. It was the smell of Silas's lonely life. He helped Gaza lie down on his own mattress, the only soft place in the entire house. She sank into it with a sigh of relief, her face tight with pain. Grok immediately scrambled to her side, pressing close. "I have to get that piece of wood out," Silas said, his voice grim. I have a bottle of cheap brandy. It will clean the wound, and maybe dull the pain." Gaza's golden eyes met his. In their depths, he saw an understanding pass. She knew what was coming. She braced herself. "Do it." The next hour was a blur of controlled violence and quiet agony. Silas sterilized his sharpest fishing knife in the flames of the fire. He gave Gaza the brandy, and she drank a large swallow without flinching, her eyes watering slightly. He poured the rest over the wound, and she hissed, her whole body tensing, but she did not cry out. Grok whimpered, hiding his face against her arm. Then came the worst part. With Gaza biting down on a strip of leather, her knuckles white, Silas used his fishing pliers to grip the splintered shard of wood. He pulled. It didn't move. It was lodged deep in the muscle. He had to twist it, working it back and forth. Gaza's muffled screams were terrible to hear. Sweat poured down Silas's face. His hands shook, but he held firm. Finally, with a sickening squelch, the wood came free. Blood welled up immediately. Silas pressed a clean rag against the wound, his stomach churning. He worked by the flickering firelight, his movements more confident now. He cleaned the gash as best he could, and then, using his net-mending needle and some boiled fishing line, he began to stitch the wound closed. His stitches were crude, ugly things, but they were tight. They would hold. Through it all, Gaza remained conscious, her eyes fixed on him. She watched him work with a warrior's intensity, as if memorizing his face, his scent, his every fumbling movement. When he was finally finished, he was trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. He slumped back on his heels, the bloody needle still in his hand. "It's done," he breathed. Gaza let out a long, shuddering sigh. The tension left her body in a wave. She looked down at the clumsy stitches on her leg, then back at him. "You have a healer's hands, for a man who reads books," she said. It wasn't quite a compliment, but it wasn't an insult either. Silas just shook his head, too tired to speak. He cleaned his tools and his hands, his mind a numb fog. He had just saved the life of a creature he had been taught his entire life to fear and kill on sight. The enormity of it was just beginning to settle on him. He looked at his larder. It was nearly bare. A half loaf of stale bread, a few wizened potatoes, and a small wedge of hard cheese. A meal for one. A meager snack for three. He took it all out. He sliced the bread and cheese and boiled the potatoes in his small pot over the fire. He offered the first portion to Grok. The boy looked at his sister, who gave another of her short, sharp nods. Hesitantly, Grok took the offered bowl. He ate like a starved animal, cramming the food into his mouth. Silas then gave a bowl to Gaza. She took it, her gaze holding his. "Why?" she asked, her voice low. "Why what?" "Why help us? We are orcs. You are human. We are enemies. This is the law." Silas sat down on the floor by the fire, his own small portion in his hands. He looked at the meager meal, at the two exhausted refugees on his bed, at the rain lashing against his patched-up window. He felt a profound weariness settle over him, a weariness that had nothing to do with physical effort. "I was hungry too," he said quietly, "and afraid, and alone. Different doesn't have to mean enemy." They ate in silence after that. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. It was a strange, fragile peace. In that small, impoverished shack, two ancient enemies shared a meal. They were no longer just a human and an orc. They were Silas, Gaza, and Grok. Three outcasts, huddled together against the storm. They were a broken, unlikely, and desperate family in the making. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Silas's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. A domestic struggle played out in the confines of the tiny shack. Garza was a warrior, not a homemaker. Her attempts to help were often disastrous. On the third day, insisting she was well enough to contribute, she tried to reinforce the flimsy door. With a single misjudged hammer blow, she shattered the frame completely, leaving it hanging crookedly on one hinge. Silas, instead of getting angry, simply found it a little funny. He spent the rest of the afternoon patiently showing her how to brace the wood, how to tap the nails in gently. Her massive, calloused hands were surprisingly deft once she learned the right amount of pressure to apply. Grok, for his part, was a whirlwind of silent curiosity. He investigated every corner of the shack, his small fingers tracing the spines of Silas's precious books. He didn't know how to read, but he seemed fascinated by the strange symbols on the pages. Silas, seeing the boy's interest, started pointing to objects and saying their names in the common tongue. "Table," he'd say, tapping the wobbly surface. "Fire. Book." Grok would listen intently, his brow furrowed in concentration, and then repeat the words in a soft, guttural whisper. Gaza watched these interactions with a quiet intensity. Her leg was healing, the ugly stitches holding firm. She was still weak, but the color was returning to her face. She spent most of her time resting, but her eyes missed nothing. She saw the way Silas shared his food without hesitation, always giving her and Grok the larger portions, even when it meant his own stomach rumbled through the night. She saw the kindness in his eyes, a softness she had never encountered in a male of any species, let alone a human. One afternoon, while Silas was out checking his fishing lines, a mostly fruitless endeavor these days, Gaza decided to tackle the leaking roof. It was a constant, maddening drip, drip, drip that fell into a bucket near the fire. She saw the pile of driftwood Silas had been saving for the task. Using the skills he had taught her with the door, she climbed onto the roof. Her weight made the whole structure groan in protest, but it held. She found the hole, and, with a precision that would have served her well on the battlefield, she began patching it. She worked for hours, her movements economical and strong, weaving the wood together, packing the gaps with mud and moss. When Silas returned, cold, wet, and empty-handed, he looked up and stopped dead. His roof, for the first time in years, was not leaking. He looked at Garza, who was sitting by the fire tending to grok, a smudge of mud on her cheek. She didn't look at him, but he could see the faintest hint of pride in the set of her shoulders. "You fixed the roof," he said, a note of awe in his voice. "The rain was loud," she replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. That night, a new level of trust settled between them. It was a fragile seed, but it had taken root. Silas, feeling a strange surge of hope, pulled out a small wooden box from under his mattress. It was old, the wood dark and smooth with age. He took a key from a string around his neck. It was a simple, rusty iron key, a worthless object to anyone else, but it was the only thing his father had left him. It was his signature item, a link to a past he barely understood. He unlocked the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single ancient book. Its cover was leather, cracked with age, and the pages were yellowed parchment. It was a book of lore, of history, of a time before the Great Wars, a time when humans and orcs, according to the forgotten legends, did not hate each other. "My father was a scholar," Silas said quietly, his voice thick with memory. "A dreamer. He believed the wall of prejudice between our people was built of lies. He collected these stories." Garza leaned closer, her golden eyes wide with a strange light. Grok peered over her shoulder. Silas opened the book to a page with a detailed drawing. It depicted a human king and an orc chieftain shaking hands. Below them, their people mingled, sharing food and music. "He said this was the truth," Silas whispered, "that our families, they weren't always enemies." Garza reached out a single, hesitant finger and traced the image of the orc chieftain. "My father, he was chieftain of the Bloodtusk clan," she said softly. "He spoke of the old ways, of honor. He said the warlords had twisted our people, turned them into monsters for their own gain. He resisted them." Her voice grew hard. "And for that, he was betrayed, murdered." The silence in the room was heavy with shared grief. "The warlord who killed him, Thrathrak Skullrender. He wanted me," Garza continued, her voice a low growl, "to be his mate, to legitimize his claim. I refused. I took Grok and I ran. Thrathrak, he hunts us." Now Silas understood. She wasn't just a deserter. She was a political refugee, the last of an honorable line, hunted by a corrupt usurper. The danger she was in was far greater than he had imagined, and by helping her, he had placed himself directly in the path of a bloodthirsty orc warlord. But as he looked at her, at the pain and defiance in her eyes, he felt no regret, only a deepening conviction. This was right. This was family. This bond, forged in desperation and sealed with shared stories, was more real than any ancient hatred. The fragile peace of their coexistence was not destined to last. The scrap was a small place, and its people were suspicious. Old Man Hemlock, who lived in the next shack over, was the first to notice something was amiss. He saw Silas buying twice as much bread when he could afford it. He heard voices from inside the shack, one of them a deep, guttural sound that made the hairs on his neck stand up. One morning, Hemlock saw her. Gaza had stepped outside for a moment, testing her leg in the pale morning light. She was still limping, but she moved with a grace that belied her size. Hemlock's eyes went wide. He stumbled back from his window, his face ashen. An orc. Thorn was harboring an orc. The news spread through the scrap like a plague. It was a whisper at first. A rumor passed between neighbors over sagging fences. Then it became a murmur of fear and anger at the communal well. An orc. Here. Among them. Had Thorn lost his mind? He was endangering them all. The prejudice that had been a distant wall of mountains was now at Silas's doorstep. People who had once given him a nod of greeting now crossed the dusty path to avoid him. Children who used to wave now pointed and whispered. The isolation he had always felt intensified, becoming a suffocating shroud. Then the debt collector came. Lord Peaton was not a lord in any real sense. He was a petty bureaucratic official from the nearby town of Greyshaw, a man who had bought the land titles to the scrap for a pittance, and now lauded his ownership over its impoverished residents. He was a man obsessed with his ledgers, his face perpetually pinched in a cruel sneer. He loved the power that came with owning the debts of others. He arrived in a small, rickety cart, flanked by two burly guards who looked as mean as he did. He marched right up to Silas's door and banged on it with the head of his cane. "Thorn!" he barked, his voice thin and sharp. "Open this door. I know you're in there." Inside, panic seized Silas. He looked at Gaza, who had instinctively grabbed a heavy piece of firewood, her knuckles white. Grok hid behind her, trembling. "Get down!" Silas hissed, his voice a panicked whisper. "Hide!" It was an order born of terror. He was the nerd, the weakling, trying to command a warrior princess. Gaza's eyes flashed with indignation for a split second. She was not a creature to hide. But then she saw the sheer terror on Silas's face, and she understood. This was his world, his rules, his danger. For his sake, she knelt, pulling Grok down with her into the darkest corner of the shack, behind a stack of old fishing nets. Silas took a breath and opened the door a crack. "Lord Peaton," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Peaton pushed the door open, striding into the small space as if he owned it. Which, Silas reflected grimly, he technically did. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the two extra bowls by the fire, the large footprint in the dirt floor. "Thorn, you are 3 months behind on your rent," Peaton sneered, tapping his ledger with a bony finger. "The debt grows. I've been lenient, given your pathetic situation, but my patience has its limits." "I'll have it soon," Silas lied. "The fishing has been poor, but it will turn around." "I'm sure it will," Peaton said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But I'm not here just about the debt. I've heard rumors, Thorn. Disturbing rumors. They say you are harboring a beast, a monster from the mountains." Silas's blood ran cold. That's ridiculous. Village gossip." Peaton smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "Is it? My guards will search the premises. If we find anything, or anyone, who doesn't belong, the debt will be the least of your worries. Harboring an orc is treason against the barony. The punishment is hanging." Silas stood frozen, his mind a maelstrom of fear. This was it. The end. They would find Gaza and Grok. They would kill them. They would hang him. All because he had chosen compassion. All because he couldn't ignore suffering. From her hiding place, Gaza watched the cruel little man threaten the one person who had shown her kindness. She felt a rage building in her chest, a cold, deadly fire. Her hand tightened on the firewood. She could kill this man and his guards before they took another breath. It would be easy. But she looked at Silas, standing there, so fragile and yet so defiant, protecting her with his own frail body. She remembered his gentle hands stitching her wound. She remembered him teaching her brother a new word. She remembered the story of the human king and the orc chieftain. Violence was her way, the way of the warlords. But Silas was teaching her a different way, a different kind of strength. And so she remained hidden. She trusted him. She put her life and her brother's life in the hands of the weak human who had shown her what true honor looked like. The debt was no longer just about a saved life. It was a bond of family, a choice. And she would honor it, even if it meant her death. The guards began their search. They were rough, kicking over Silas's meager belongings, sneering at his poverty. One of them approached the pile of nets in the corner. He raised his spear, ready to poke into the shadows. Silas's heart stopped. But just as the guard was about to thrust the spear forward, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts, the thunder of heavy, running feet. A different kind of fear, raw and primal, filled the air. Lord Peaton and his guards froze, turning toward the door. Silas's blood ran even colder, if that were possible. He knew that sound. It was the sound of warriors, not the clumsy tramp of town guards, the disciplined, earth-shaking tread of a war band. A massive form filled the doorway, blocking out the light. He was huge, even for an orc, clad in black iron armor festooned with skulls. A jagged scar ran down one side of his face, and his tusks were capped with sharpened steel. His eyes, small and cruel, scanned the room. This was not a refugee. This was a predator. "I am Thrathrak Skullrender," the warlord boomed, his voice a gravelly roar that shook the very foundations of the shack. "I am told the traitor Gaza is here. Give her to me, now." Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below, would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Thrathrak wasn't finished yet. The crisis had arrived not as a single wave, but as a terrifying two-pronged assault. On one side stood Lord Peaton, the embodiment of bureaucratic cruelty, his ledger a weapon of slow starvation and eviction. On the other stood Thrathrak Skullrender, the avatar of bloodthirsty ambition, his axe promising a swift, brutal end. Silas was trapped between them, a sapling caught between two grinding millstones. Lord Peaton, for all his bluster, visibly shrank in the presence of the warlord. His face, usually pinched with arrogance, was now pale with undisguised terror. His two guards looked ready to bolt. This was a monster from their nightmares made real. Thrathrak paid the humans no mind. They were insects. His cold, predatory eyes swept the room again, and this time they locked onto the pile of fishing nets in the corner. He saw a flicker of movement, a small green hand clutching a fold of leather. A cruel smile twisted his lips. "So, the little rat hides," he growled. He took a step into the shack, his presence sucking all the air from the room. "Come out, Gaza. Your father's weakness dies with you. Join me, and you will be the mother of a new dynasty. Refuse, and your brother will watch you die." From the shadows, Gaza's voice, low and filled with venom, answered him. "I would sooner die in a ditch than stand by a coward who murders his chieftain in the dark." Thrathrak laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Honor? Honor is a fool's shield. Power is the only truth." He raised his massive double-bladed axe. "And I have the power." This was it, the moment of truth. Everything converged on this single, desperate point in time. Silas looked from the terrified face of Lord Peton to the murderous sneer of Thrathrak. He looked at the shadows where the only family he had ever known was hiding. And the fatal strength within him, his inability to ignore suffering, solidified into something new. It became iron. He stepped forward. He, Silas Thorne, the thin, reedy scholar, the weakling, the outcast. He planted himself directly between the warlord and the corner where Garza and Grok were hidden. "You will not touch them," Silas said. His voice didn't boom, it didn't roar, but it carried a weight of conviction that made both Peton and Thrathrak pause. It was the voice of a man with nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing to fear. Thrathrak stared down at him, a look of genuine disbelief on his scarred face. "You," he scoffed, "a little human twig. You would die for her?" "She is my family," Silas said simply. The words hung in the air, a profound and shocking truth. Lord Peton, seeing a chance to regain some semblance of control and perhaps save his own skin, seized the opportunity. "He's an outlaw!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Silas. "A traitor! He admits to harboring the beast. Seize him, by order of the Baron!" The villagers, drawn by the commotion, had begun to gather outside. They peered into the shack, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They heard Peton's decree. They saw the weak scholar standing against the monster. Thrathrak ignored Peton. He was focused on Silas. "Family," the warlord spat, as if the word were poison. "The pup of a dead chieftain and a human runt. A fitting family for a traitor. I will kill you first. A small appetizer." He advanced on Silas, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Silas stood his ground, his heart hammering but his will unbroken. He reached into his tunic, and his fingers closed around the one thing of value he owned, the rusty key. It was a foolish, sentimental gesture, a prayer to a dead father. But as his fingers touched the cold iron, an idea sparked in his mind, a desperate, insane gamble. The book, the history, the drawing of the king and the chieftain. Just as Thrathrak raised his axe, Garza exploded from the corner. She moved with a speed and ferocity that defied her still healing injury. She didn't have a sword, but she had the heavy piece of firewood, and she swung it like a club, aiming for the warlord's unhelmeted head. Thrathrak, caught by surprise, barely managed to turn the blow, catching the wood on his armored shoulder. The impact sent a jarring shock through him, and he staggered back a step. Garza placed herself in front of Silas, a mirror image of what he had just done for her. The strong orc now protecting the weak human. "You will not touch him," she snarled, her golden eyes blazing with protective fury. The confrontation spilled out of the shack and into the dusty clearing. Villagers scattered, forming a wide, terrified circle. It was a public spectacle now. Lord Peton and his guards huddled near his cart, while Thrathrak and Garza faced each other, circling like wolves. "You have grown bold in your exile, little rat," Thrathrak sneered. "And foolish. You trade your life for this thing?" He gestured at Silas with his axe. "He has more honor in his little finger than you have in your entire rotten body," Garza retorted. This was Silas's chance. While all eyes were on the two orcs, he darted back into his shack. He fumbled with the lock on the wooden box, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key. He threw open the lid and grabbed the ancient book. He also grabbed something else, something Garza had given him to hold, something she had concealed in her tunic. A small, heavy pouch. He ran back outside, holding the book aloft. "Stop!" he yelled, his voice cracking. Everyone turned to look at him. He looked ridiculous, a frantic scholar waving a dusty book in the middle of a deadly standoff. "You're wrong, Thrathrak," Silas shouted, his voice gaining strength. "Honor is not a fool's shield. It's a foundation. Our peoples were not always enemies." He thrust the book at the nearest villager, Old Man Hemlock, who flinched but took it. Look at the drawings, the histories." Silas turned to Lord Peaton. "And you talk of debt." He strode toward the trembling bureaucrat. "You want your payment? You want to settle the ledger?" He opened the small, heavy pouch Garza had given him, and he turned it upside down. It was not gold that fell out. It was something far more valuable, at least to an orc. Teeth. Dozens of them. The razor-sharp fangs of cave bears, shadow cats, and other great beasts. To the orcs of the old clans, these were trophies. Each one represented a great deed, a display of strength and honor. They were a form of currency, a measure of worth far more significant than gold. But mixed in with the teeth was something else, a single heavy piece of carved jade. It was a seal, an official signet, bearing the crest of a tusked boar wreathed in mountain laurels. Thrathrak's eyes went wide. He recognized it. Every orc would recognize it. It was not the seal of a minor clan chieftain. It was the royal signet of the high chieftain of the entire orcish hegemony, a position that had been vacant for 500 years, ever since the old alliances had crumbled. "That's not possible," Thrathrak whispered, his arrogance finally cracking. The line of the high chieftain was broken, lost. "It was not lost," Garza said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. She stepped forward, her limp barely noticeable. "It was hidden. My father was no mere clan leader. He was Gor-Thak, the direct descendant of the last High King, living in self-imposed exile, waiting for the time when our people would turn from the path of warlords and remember the old ways." The truth fell like a thunderclap. Garza was not just a chieftain's daughter. She was royalty, a princess, the last heir to the orcish throne. Thrathrak had not just murdered a rival, he had committed high treason against the oldest law of their people. His claim, built on lies and murder, was nothing. "I am Garza, daughter of Gor-Thak, of the Blood Tusk clan, heir to the high seat," she declared, her voice resonating across the silent clearing. "And I name you, Thrathrak, a traitor and a murderer. You have no honor, you have no claim, you are nothing." Thrathrak was stunned. His entire world had just been upended. He looked at the faces of the villagers, who were staring at Garza with a new kind of awe and fear. He looked at the royal signet lying in the dust. His power was built on the perception of strength, but this was a truth that could shatter his entire warband. If word of this got out, any clan with a shred of honor would turn on him. "Lies!" he roared, but his voice lacked conviction. He was desperate now. "A trick! A human's trick!" He lunged, not at Garza, but at Silas. If he could kill the source of this revelation, perhaps he could salvage the situation. But he had underestimated the bond between them. As his axe swung down, Silas didn't flinch. And Garza moved like lightning. She threw her body in front of Silas, taking the blow not on her flesh, but on her armored vambrace. The sound of steel on steel rang out like a bell. The force of the blow sent her stumbling back, but she held her ground. "A trick!" Silas yelled, his voice filled with righteous fury. He held up his rusty key. "This key belonged to my ancestor. He was the lawmaster charged by the human king to safeguard the histories, and he was given a second charge, to hold a message for the heir of Gorthak should they ever return. He pointed to the royal signet on the ground. "Look at the back." Garza, never taking her eyes off Thrathrak, bent and snatched the signet. She turned it over. Carved into the back of the jade, in tiny, faint runes, was a symbol. A key. A simple, rusty iron key. The exact shape as the one hanging around Silas's neck. Their ancestors had known. They had planned. They had left a prophecy in metal and stone, a hope that one day the two lines would meet again. The rusty key wasn't just a memento. It was the other half of the truth. A key to a forgotten future. The revelation was absolute, undeniable. Thrathrak was exposed. His authority, his power, his very identity as a leader was utterly destroyed in that single moment. He was no conqueror. He was just a common murderer who had committed sacrilege. He let out a wordless roar of pure rage and lunged again, a wild, desperate animal. But this time, the villagers, who had been frozen in fear, moved. Old Man Hemlock, brandishing a pitchfork, jabbed at the warlord's leg. Another villager threw a rock. They were small actions, clumsy and fearful, but they were actions. They were choosing a side. They were defending the scholar who had shown them the truth, and the princess who had been revealed in their midst. The distraction was all Garza needed. She sidestepped Thrathrak's clumsy charge and brought the heavy firewood club down on the back of his unarmored knee. There was a sickening crack. Thrathrak screamed and collapsed, his leg buckling beneath him. He lay on the ground, defeated. Not by a grand army, but by a wounded orc princess, a weak human scholar, and the undeniable weight of the truth. Lord Peaton stood gaping, his ledger forgotten in his hand. The debt, the eviction, all of it seemed so small, so petty, in the face of this epic revelation. Silas walked over to the fallen warlord. He looked down at the monster who had threatened to destroy everything he cared about. He felt no triumph, only a great, sad weariness. "It's over, Thrathrak," he said. Garza stood over him, her expression grim. "You will be taken back to the mountains," she said, her voice cold as iron. "You will face the judgment of the clans. You will answer for my father's murder." The crisis had passed. The antagonists were broken. The weak human had stood up for the strong orc, and in doing so, had revealed a strength of his own that no one, least of all himself, had ever suspected he possessed. And the orc princess had revealed a hidden value, a truth so powerful it could remake their broken world. The bond was sealed, not in magic, but in shared history, shared sacrifice, and the simple, revolutionary choice to call each other family. The aftermath of the confrontation was as strange and unsettling as the event itself. Thrathrak, his leg broken and his spirit shattered, was bound with rope by the very villagers who had feared him moments before. Garza, now carrying the undeniable weight of her lineage, oversaw it all with a grim, regal bearing. She sent one of Thrathrak's own warriors, a young orc who looked more relieved than defeated, back to the mountains with a message. The heir of Gorthak had returned. A council of clans was to be called. Justice would be done. Lord Peaton, in the face of this world-altering revelation, simply crumbled. His threats of eviction and hanging seemed absurd. He stammered a few apologies, climbed into his cart, and fled back to Greyshaw, his precious ledger of debts all but forgotten. The power of his ink and paper was nothing against the power of a royal signet and a united community. The debt was gone, erased not by coin, but by courage. In the days that followed, a slow, cautious transformation began in the scrap. The story of what happened in front of Silas's shack spread like wildfire. The ancient book was passed from hand to hand, the villagers gazing in wonder at the drawings of a peaceful past. They looked at Garza not as a monster, but as a protector, a princess. They looked at Silas not as a fool, but as a hero. The first change was the food. A woman whose name Silas had never even known left a basket of fresh baked bread on his doorstep. Old Man Hemlock appeared with a string of fish, muttering something about a good catch. People started visiting, not to stare or accuse, but to offer help. They brought wood to properly rebuild his goat pen. They brought nails and tar to permanently seal his roof. They brought scraps of cloth to mend his clothes. His house, once a symbol of his isolation, became the center of the community. Garza, with her straightforward manner and immense strength, directed the repairs. She showed the men how to properly brace a wall, her warrior's knowledge of fortification proving surprisingly useful. Grok, no longer hiding in the shadows, played with the village children. They were hesitant at first, but children have less patience for ancient hatreds. Soon their laughter, a mix of human and orcish sounds, filled the air. A week later, a delegation arrived from the Broken Fang Mountains. It was not a war band, it was a procession of clan elders, their faces weathered and grim. They came not with axes drawn, but with heads bowed. They stopped before Silas's shack and knelt before Garza. They had heard the summons. They had seen the proof from the returning warrior. They acknowledged her as the heir of Gor-Thak. The warlord Thrathrak was taken away, his fate to be decided by Orcish law. Justice, Garza had promised, and justice would be delivered. His era of blood and fear was over. With the elders came resources, food, tools, and skilled orc artisans. They looked at the ramshackle hovels of the scrap, and then at the half-repaired shack of their princess, and they set to work. The sound of hammers and saws, both human and orcish, became the new music of the scrap. Silas's house was the first to be properly rebuilt. It was no longer a shack, but a sturdy cottage, with real windows and a stone foundation. The orcs, masters of stonework, built him a new fireplace that drew perfectly and filled the room with warmth. The humans, with their knowledge of carpentry and thatching, raised a new watertight roof. A new community was being forged, not just from wood and stone, but from shared effort and mutual respect. An orc elder sat with Old Man Hemlock, sharing a pipe and discussing the best ways to smoke fish. A human woman taught a young orc female how to weave fishing nets. Silas found himself at the center of it all, translating not just words, but ideas and customs. He would spend hours with the orc elders, poring over his ancestors' book, piecing together their shared history, rediscovering the traditions that had been lost to centuries of war. Different doesn't mean enemy. It was a simple phrase he had spoken in a moment of desperation, but it had become the founding principle of their new world. The wall of prejudice had not just been breached, it was being dismantled, stone by stone, and its pieces were being used to build bridges. One evening, months later, the work for the day was done. A great fire burned in the center of the newly expanded village square. Humans and orcs sat together, sharing a feast of roasted boar and fresh-baked bread. Music played, a strange and beautiful fusion of human pipes and orcish drums. Silas and Garza stood on the porch of their new home, watching the scene. Grok was asleep inside, exhausted from a day of playing. The house was warm, the larder was full, and the debt was gone. The future, once a terrifying void, now seemed bright with promise. Garza was no longer just a refugee. She was a leader, her people's hope for a new future. She would soon have to return to the mountains to formally claim her title, and guide her people back to the old ways. But tonight, she was just Garza. "You did this, Silas," she said quietly, her voice soft. "All of this, with your books and your kindness." Silas shook his head. He looked at his hands, no longer just the hands of a scholar, but calloused from work, from building. "No," he said, "we did this. You showed them what honor looks like. I just reminded them of a story they had forgotten." He reached for the string around his neck. The rusty key was still there. He looked at it, then at Gaza, at the home they had built, at the family they had forged. The key had not opened a box of treasure. It had opened a door to a future he never could have imagined. Gaza placed her large, warm hand over his. "This is your home, Silas Thorne. Here, with us. Whether it is in this small cottage by the sea, or in the great halls of my ancestors. Where we are, you belong." He looked into her golden eyes and saw not a princess or a warrior, but his friend, his family. He smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that reached his eyes. "I know," he said. The ache of hunger and the dampness of poverty were gone, replaced by the warmth of a fire and the strength of a bond that had remade their world. And that is how a poor human and an orcish princess proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.